And since this is a workshop, if you fill up from the front, that means the tables will all be full. And part of this is about diverse thinking. So the more opinions on each table, the better the workshop will work. You will need pens or distribute these. And when you're on their tables, or know which tables to distribute them to. So distribute these out, but don't mix the colours in a table. So one table gets one colour. This is very old school. This is pre-Post-it era. You're dealing with index cards here. Back in the day, no glue wasted in this show. Wow, that's the biggest screen I have ever stood in front of, I can tell you. Okay, thank you. So welcome to the talk. So this is my first time in India, and I had an absolute fabulous time. I did speak at Agile India 2022. It was all online, but it's absolutely brilliant to be here in person. So my contact details are at the bottom, and you'll get them at the end as well. But this is perhaps a new practice for many of you. It's critical thinking, and the brand is Red Team Thinking, which has a long history I will speak about and introduce. The format of this will come into in a second, but basically, here's the format for today. I'm going to get you doing an activity right away, and a challenge to you, talk about some problems in Agile, referencing Scott's fabulous talk earlier, that will feature prominently. Talk about biases and how they influence our decision-making process, how critical thinking can help in decision support, and then relating that back to Agile, and then how to implement it. So you're walking away from today with some practices you can take and implement right away where you are. There is so much I could talk about, so we'll cover some stuff in depth, but also I will give you an overview of the whole suite of tools. It's like liberating structures. There's a whole suite of tools. There's no framework or process. It's just the right tool for the right job. So it'll help you with documenting the list and how they can be categorized. And then we'll wrap up, and hopefully there'll be time at the end for Q&A. And I'll also give you some customer feedback and where this is actually being used successfully already. As this is a workshop, that's all the workshop activities. So this was originally a 50-minute talk. I've added in all that stuff to make it more workshop and interactive. So hopefully it's all going to work slickly. So the first thing for you to think about is what keeps the best ideas from surfacing and being talked about in your organization. Now, to do this, we use Think, Write, Share. Now, you may well use that technique already in retrospectives, right? But I'm talking about it here for two important reasons. One is I'm going to explain the neuroscience of it, and this is a talk about neuroscience. And secondly, I'm also going to talk about leadership a lot. And guess what? Those leaders way up at the top of the organization probably aren't doing retrospectives. So if you want to explain this to them, you need to do it in a way that makes sense outside of a retrospective. So Think, Write, Share, can everybody see that okay? Think, Write, Share is about not just jotting down the first thing that comes to mind. It's about taking, let's say, up to about a minute to mull it over in your head, contemplate it, and then write it down. And the reason that this neuroscience works is they've done brain scans on people to show that when they're writing things down, it activates a different part of the brain. So you're actually properly engaging system 2 thinking, as described by Daniel Kahneman. It is different thought processes. And also, if you've only got something as small as an index card, you're being forced to rationalize and compress that. So that's how it works at a neuroscience level. And the share part, well, of course, in retrospective, you then share it. What we're avoiding with that is because we're now committed, it's stopping early convergence in the first person that spoke, right? So not only are you getting the full diversity of opinion in the room, but also I would encourage you, that's why you've all got one color per table, to mix the cards up. And that way you're disassociating the person who said the thing from the person who's then reading it back. It might be your card. We don't care, right? It's just because we want to evaluate the idea and not the person who said it. So use that think, write, share, and also the other practice to facilitate voices not dominating is everybody speaks once before anybody speaks twice as a general practice. And that stops one voice dominating the room and the conversation. So what I'd like you to do is to stop, think for a minute, contemplate it in your head, then after a minute, write down what keeps the best ideas from surfacing in your organization. Give you another 30 seconds of thinking. So having now taken a minute, now write it down. And when everybody in the table has written down what keeps the best ideas from surfacing, then shuffle the cards up and deal them out again and have a look. So although you might be doing this already in retrospectives, as I say, it's important to understand the neuroscience, and it's important to be able to explain that to leaders who are not doing retrospectives. You ready to shuffle and discuss? It doesn't matter if you get your own card. And of course, that's why I made the cards all the same color, so you can't be attributed back. So on Mural or on an online tool, you would use anonymous, the incognito mode. Well, this is incognito mode in real life, right? So a couple of minutes of just discussing that so you can get the theme of what has come out. If you pick just one or two themes, just for simplicity. When you're ready, having discussed and summarized that, please go to ahaslides.com India, for Agile India, or scan the code. And because it would take too long to go around the whole room, you can all share and get everybody's voice. You can all join in, and I will ensure that this is started so you can start to submit your ideas. Everybody got that okay? So you can join? It's just AHA Slides India. What's that? It doesn't really matter. If you've got Wi-Fi, fantastic. If you've got mobile phone access, fantastic. If you don't have any access at all, you get the chance to put 3 words in, so share it with a neighbor. And I need to start the slides. Open the submissions. So I see people typing away. Excellent, good job. And I'd be interested to see what you're sharing. Now, interesting as a side story, it's on Wikipedia, but in 1990, I proposed a thing that you would now recognize as being a browser and social media. The organization dismissed that as that will never take off. That's a great example of an idea not surfacing in the organization. You can see the story in Wikipedia, right? The submissions are now closed. So there we go. So what I did there as well is I shared the result right at the end rather than being interactive. So you can see all of this stuff, and I'll share this content afterwards, but it's really interesting to see lots of people are having problems with this. So this is the sort of thing that helps with that problem, right? So getting the voices in the room and everybody being heard, whether they're a junior or senior or wherever, or they're male, female, or race, whatever, is leveling the playing field. So we take advantage of the experience in the organization rather than having to buy in a consultant that thinks they might have the right answer. So next one is challenges. Oh, I do that. I need to come out of the deck to go on to the next slide. So what is red team thinking? Like, let's start and explain the context here. It is a cognitive capability that engages critical thinking, as you've been doing just there, exposes threats and identifies opportunities. This has come from the military. It's now being increasingly used within Agile. Some of it overlaps with practices you're using already. Enables distributed decision-making, just as we've done there. If you can't see, let me know. And it encourages diversity of thought, because we're not biased to who said the idea. And it's a practice. So it's like being Agile. It's not, we'll do these steps and then we've got the answer. It's a toolbox of stuff, and then we pick and choose the tools as needed in the context. So it's like proper coaching. What do we do in what context? What's the tool that we deploy? So it's a change in attitude towards constructive criticism and constructive dissent. And this is what it achieves: rapid decision-making, because we've got a process to follow, the quality of decision-making, because we've got analytical techniques to support it, and importantly, it grows psychological safety. Now, we've known about that for a while, that psychological safety really matters. But the thing is, often when we talk about growing psychological safety, it's about leaders being vulnerable, or talking about their failures and how they turn that around, or trying to get more personal and all these things. And guess what? Many leaders aren't quite up for that sort of stuff, right? And I'm not saying don't do that, but it's only one tool, right? The other aspect of that we don't do much is talking about the elephant in the room, the lies we tell ourselves. I'll come on to that practice in a minute and show how powerful it can be. And when we start being honest about the lies we tell ourselves, that grows psychological safety, because it means we're all talking about the things that really matter rather than trying to hide them under the carpet. These are proven tools. They have actually been used, some of them for hundreds of years. I'll come into that in a second. But they actually solve real problems. At the end, are talk about some of the customers that are using this. And who's it for? Now, originally, I had thought that this would be the main audience, the people that decide on product or prioritize work or understand about value and what we're going to do next, a more product community. But then, of course, I had in the coaches that then support those product managers and leaders. But then it's also leaders themselves, like heads of transformation, all these people that make decisions. But then I just came to the conclusion that a bit like strategy, but was on my earlier talks, and a bit like quality, and a bit like being customer-centric, if everybody gets it, that's a far more powerful message. It's a culture shift. So no silos here, right? If everybody does it, we're all like thinking in the same way. And when they set up the Red Teaming University in the US, it wasn't called that because that would then give the other military organizations a bit of a hint of what it was up to. It was not just about people going through a 3-month exercise. It was about go out to your organizations and help to change how they work. So I'll start with a problem statement. Now, this may sound familiar to you. What's the problem statement here? Let's recap about Scott's talk, the state of Agile. I'll bring in some real data, because it always helps to bring about data rather than opinions here. A little bit of analysis on that, and then what can we do? So, first part of data, state of Agile. Leadership up here. Teams not empowered to be self-organized. Well, who's empowering them or not? Leaders, right? And also what Agile does and can do is clarity and clear priorities and direction. Again, clarity and alignment. So there's lots of stuff that's actually coming down from leadership about purpose and clarity. David Marquet talks about this. These are the things that the data is telling us we struggle with. Yet, here we go, it's Scott again. So when he put this out, and I took a screenshot, he's claiming it was about too much certification, too much framework, not enough real deliverables. Fair points, right? There's the link. Please read the full set of 3. I'm only taking a snapshot here. I don't want to misrepresent Scott. But at the same time, although interesting, when I looked at that, I thought, maybe it's not quite there. So what I'd like to do is get your opinions. What do you think? And again, use think, write, share. And I need to move on so you're on, what do you think? Oops. I will bring up the next one so you can contribute to that. Good old tech. That was your answers before. So now, again, you can contribute and say, well, what do you think? What's your challenges with Agile? This time you don't need the cards, just do it straight on the board for speed. I can see there's at least 9 people typing, it's great. This is just on AHA slides, so if you do AHA slides and call me India, it should be up on your phones if you've been there already for the first part. I've got 1 submission already. And see, again, what I'm doing is hiding it so the reveal at the end, so you're all contributing independently. Three submissions so far. So we've got our stop when we've got to about 10 or 12 so that we've got a reasonable sample. $18 people contributing. Again, the more people that contribute, the more data we get, and it's always useful to get this, this feedback. The more coming in now, so I will wait for one more. So there we go. So these are the problems that you're seeing. A lot of this, status quo, lack of empowerment, leadership mindset. So that leadership mindset, you're in the right talk, right? I'm just going to come on to that. So all this stuff, answers are still coming in. And again, I'll share this content afterwards so you've got access to it. But when we go back to what Scott was talking about, he was saying the problems with Agile, so I'll just say, we've got the data here about what's going on in Agile. But the opinions from Scott, which great opinion, but his opinion was there's too many certificates. However, that solution doesn't address the problem of leadership. And when I spoke to Scott, I asked him a question during his talk, and we sort of agreed that although people have certificates, the fault really lay with the process of people doing the hiring who thought the certificates really mattered over 10 years of relevant experience. So because that process was flawed, that's what led to the issue. But what happens is in actually analyzing the problem using critical thinking, we had a productive discussion to get to the problem. So it was an analysis of the problem and walking through it. because this is what we call a logical fallacy, non sequitur in Latin. It does not follow. So as London Underground quote, mind the gap between the argument and the problem, because unless they connect, it's not really a very sound argument. Which then takes me on to what could be the explanation. This is Bryce, who I learn off of, and this is David Marquet, who wrote Turn the Ship Around. They know one another. David Marquet's been on Bryce's podcast. And David Marquet, Turn the Ship Around, said basically what's going on, organizations are biased to blame the doers rather than the deciders because they focus on the errors in execution rather than the decisions that were made weeks, months, or even further back. And Bryce agrees, they've seen that a lot. So that's kind of symptomatic of what's really going wrong here. So again, the LinkedIn posts are there. You can go and check them and see what the follow-up and conversations are all about. So I think there probably is a more plausible explanation. So now I'm going to take you onto a tool. We'll use Think, Write, Share. This is the next one called Argument Dissection. Now this is quite complex, so I'll only just introduce it, but the next tool will be more hands-on. In Argument Dissection, the goal is to help your client evaluate or consider the validity of information, like a proposal for a project, a business plan. Does this make sense? Does it really add up? The what is the method, it's a method for analyzing the arguments, and there is a structured set of things you can run through to check the arguments to see if there's any logical fallacies. Does it actually make sense? Does it show any biases towards, well, it worked the last time, it will work the next time, or any other structural weaknesses? You can practice this in politicians. There's plenty of content to work from there. There are 16 questions. I won't go through all of them, but the very first one is, does the argument actually address the problem? And it didn't there, but it facilitated a productive discussion. And that's really what it's about. It's not about chucking away the work. It's about taking the work and making it better through productive dialogue. And so, onto the next tool. Now, the reason that I moved on to this tool is this is a very productive tool to start with if you're then going out into your teams and applying this type of thing. So this is about ensuring you're solving the right problem. So it is related. And look, everybody's clear. Purpose and desired entity are clear. So that talks to the alignment issues that we were seeing before. So this tool will help you to address the problem. There are 6 questions, but importantly, you don't have to do all 6. Because the first one is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Well, do we need to solve the problem of Agile certification, right? First question. The second one is that the right problem to solve? Well, if there was less certification, which is what we're talking about, would that actually make things better? Well, if it doesn't, it's not the right problem. And the third one is, if you do this, what are you choosing not to do? Well, maybe it's the leadership, as was shown in the first survey. That was the thing where the problem lay. Now, the next part is as I say, the 6 questions. However, often just asking the first one, and this has happened in banks, when you've done Think, Write, Share in a bank, everybody writes it down and go, what problem we're trying to solve? And 10 people come up with 10 opinions. You're probably going to go, we should maybe stop there and come back with actually alignment on the problem first. You don't have to do all 6. Sometimes the first question is powerful enough. And again, the structured walking through helps you to get alignment on the right problem. A little bit of practice now. To you, what is the problem your organizational strategy is trying to solve? And then to think, is it the right problem? And if you do this, what are you choosing not to do? Because although you can do multiple things at once, often that leads to incompatibilities. Apple chose to prioritize privacy, right? Fine, nothing wrong with that. But because they're doing that and they're not selling customer data, their products cost more. Google makes money off of personalized advertising. So therefore, they're making money off of your data. Therefore, they sell cheaper products often. So you either choose to do one thing or the other. You can't do both. Both are successful. I'm not taking a judgment, but you can choose to only do one of them. So how about 5 minutes for you to just reflect in your groups on those first 3 questions? I wish that this had a timer, or keep you straight. So if you take a little bit of time to just sit and think. Even do you know? Is there clarity in the problem? If you can't think of a good example for your organization, then just pick a different one or discuss in your groups, right? If anybody needs a hand, let me know. You start. Okay. About a minute left. So if you finish up now, so just wait. Is there anybody in the room who wants to put up their hand who has no for that your organization is solving the wrong problem? Anybody? No, one person over there. The microphone's just coming over so everybody can hear. Hang on a second.
Testing. Yeah, it's working. So my organization, we're consultants.
Yeah.
And we're trying to change the way we approach consultancy.
Okay.
Less about the money and more about the goals. And the organization tries to solve that by offering a lot of autonomy to the employees. And that's an interesting approach, but I'm convinced it's not the right problem to solve.
Okay. So it is interesting, and if you ran through this exercise and called it out, because, so can you just get everybody's attention, please, now? It's nice to have the conversation, but we're stuck for time. So interestingly, so you're choosing not to do something else. After the 5-minute reflection, you can then play this forward and go, well, what next? If you persist with that, this is part 2, if you need those questions, what will your organization look like? So what behaviors will it drive? What will be the impact on your customers or stakeholders? And also, what's the impact on the wider market? So you're starting to model the future a little bit. Say, if we persist on this path, what would it be? Now, as an example, we've all heard about Kodak's failure. Guess what? Back in the 1980s, I bought Fujifilm, right? Fuji and Kodak were competitors. Kodak went bankrupt, Fuji didn't. There's a control group there, right? So one succeeded and the other one didn't. Kodak focused on the film market and optimizing for making money off of film processing. Fuji started to realize things were going to change. They focused on the chemicals market and moved into medical imaging and a whole lot of other areas, pivoted, and now eventually Fuji's now moving back to making cameras. Fuji survived by realizing what the future looked like and what problem they needed to solve. So now we're going to take this slightly upper level to real leadership level. So this isn't just Agile leaders, this is leaders globally. So there was a survey done in 2023, Director Institute, so that'd be like the Institute of Directors in the UK. 24 of those organizations around the world, of the 150,000 directors, did a survey. These are the problems that leaders are having outside of, we know about what's going on in Agile, but this is what's going on in the much broader world. There's a lot of writing. You'll get the slides or update the deck on the portal, so you'll get the slide afterwards to see all this content. And there were 6 themes. Decision-making is right in there. And of course, decision-making then affects how you do governance. It affects how you might approach climate change. What could you do about that? It affects how you do evaluations of who should be on the board. This impacts those 3. But just to pick them out here, this is about, those are the words there, effective dialogue. Right? That's what I had with Scott this morning. That's a problem that directors are having. This one is about decision-making, which is what this talk is all about. And this one is about diversity and inclusion and ensuring everybody gets heard. You don't necessarily need a DEI policy, you just need to have the processes that ensure that everybody gets heard and listened to, irrespective of their age or their experience or their background. And then we get equal respect for the idea rather than the individual. But I'm not saying do away with DEI, it's useful, but you can still do this even if your DEI policies have been taken away by leadership being political. But of course, that decision-making affects the other 3 too. So this talk directly relates to managerial problems right across the globe. So let's stop blaming leadership like the Agile talk was. So leaders are not at fault. They need a hand. They're struggling, right? So let's turn this around into productive and positive conversation. It's difficult. but give them some tools and it might make their lives a bit simpler. It, as I've just shown, it addresses the problem, and they're already proven to work. We've got case studies. Let's stop attacking coaches and trainers because it's not going to help at that level. There is another practice, I'm going to briefly mention some, but 4 ways of seeing can understand perspectives. So a bit like personas and product ownership, when we look at people using the site, we might develop personas. This is a similar practice, but 4 ways of seeing is how do, let's say, Agile coaches see themselves? How does the organization see Agile coaches? How does Agile coaches see the organization? And how does the organization see itself? So that 4 ways of looking at a problem can help to draw out where there's commonalities you can build on and where there's differences you need to discuss, so there's alignment. He said Agile was dead. Analytical thinking is the top core skill in a report that came out only a few months ago. Agility is number 2. Again, you can check the data for yourself. Agility is not dead, it's number 2. And I'm talking about analytical thinking and leadership. So we've covered the first 3 from real data in the Future Jobs report. And where is AI? Not on the list. The previous 2 editions said analytical thinking is the top skill. 3 years in a row, independent data. They're not there to sell anything. They're just telling you what the state of the market is. Here is Marshall Goldsmith. He's a coach, not an Agile coach, an executive coach, and probably the best known in the world. Multiple best-selling books, $50,000 for a speaking engagement from this guy. He's still working in his 70s, but now finally ramping down. Multi-millionaire off of coaching, probably the world's best-known coach. He has given us a quote on how important red team thinking is. If your management is not convinced, get them to read his work. He's respectable as a leadership, and sometimes that's the lever you need for leaders to kind of buy into something new. I've chucked in a few Nobel laureates just to add weight to my argument, that rather than relying on a few people, coming with their opinions, and this is the answer, this is the way, listen to me, let's use the diversity in the room. This is such a true statement, you can't possibly disagree with it, right? You can't draw up a list of things that would never occur to you. Of course you can't. So use the wisdom in the room and use the wisdom in the organization. And again, Nobel laureates are pretty clever people, right? So again, refer to the people that actually know about this subject matter. So I'm moving on now to biases in decision making and why this matters. Some simple maths. A bat and ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs exactly $1 more than the ball. What does the ball cost in cents? Let's do this every time, it's rather annoying. When this loads up, please join the code again. It should now move on. This is the countdown. Just quick answers here. I'm just trying to get. You've got 20 seconds to put down your answer. Six, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Well done. So you all got. I probably gave you far too much time for that, right? A lot of people get this wrong. So 14 people were on, but only 5 got the right answer. But if we do this quickly, a lot of people get it wrong because the data, or go back to the main slide, tells us that so 5 cents, and that's the answer. But a lot of people, when you say like just give me that answer in 10 seconds, just jump to the wrong answer. There was a massive debate on LinkedIn over this. And everybody said, it's a trick question. It's not. You just have to do what you just did. Stop and think rather than did 10 come to your head first? And then yeah, exactly. So that's what happened. 10 came to your head first, and you had to stop and correct yourself. And that's showing a bias, because this is referenced in Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, in which this and 2 other questions were given to a set of students. 50% at top universities got at least 1 question wrong. The other 2 were of a similar nature. And it just shows that even clever people want to be smart, want to come up with that quick answer. They're getting it wrong, and other universities didn't even do as well as that. It was shocking. That's not even a hard problem. You just have to stop and think rather than using your bias to jump to the conclusion. Again, real data, right? You can check it in the book. Thinking Fast and Slow references this article below so you can see the full study. So Daniel Kahneman said this. Our brain actually has 2 systems. System 1 is fast, can do things in parallel, doesn't use so much energy. System 2 is cognitive thinking, which is slow and hard work. The brain will default to system 1 wherever it can, so therefore it is a machine for jumping to conclusions to get the fast answer rather than the well thought through answer. Here's a general from World War II. If everybody's thinking alike, then somebody's not thinking. They're just listening to instructions. They're not wanting to challenge. Well, that sounds plausible, or go along with it. There are a few other examples of that coming up. But again, this isn't new. It's about understanding how people work and how the brain works so we can actually overcome this. So a couple of recent examples. This was last summer. David Cameron, ex-Prime Minister, when he gave evidence, talked about groupthink. This actually was the headline on the BBC News when the report came out. Groupthink became a headline on BBC News, right? I know what groupthink is, but this is probably a new word to most of the audience. And groupthink is basically everybody thinking the same. The error was that they thought that COVID would be the same as the flu without considering other possibilities, therefore they didn't plan properly. That's groupthink, that's a bias, that's what we need to watch out for. Practices to counter groupthink. Well, I've just used think, right, share, right? So everybody comes with their own opinion. We practiced that one already. Devil's advocacy. Taking a contrary position to argue it. Devil's advocacy goes back to the 16th century. It was an office set up by the Vatican to advocate the position of the devil, which was a contrary position for somebody wanting to be a sainthood. There was too many applications for sainthood. So they actually employed critical thinking to say, is there a logical explanation for this miracle? And lo and behold, the application for sainthood then went down. It did its job, right? On the contrary, which is a routine thinking practice, which employs devil advocacy with some structured arguments to back it up. So we're looking at maybe, is the opposite true? Is there an alternative explanation? So we're digging a little bit deeper than just being the opposite. We'll talk about Nike, another big disaster. This was last year. They relied a lot on data, and they stopped their vision about sustainable growth, and they started to focus on loyalty. I quite like this, I just can't. What happened? There's a financial results from last June. So this was written about Kodak's and Blockbuster 20 years ago. This is still happening right now, right? That's what happened. In fact, I think I'll just make that really big because that's the sort of number that would put most businesses out of business. Nike could have been the next Kodak, right? That's how much they lost by expecting a consultancy to come in and telling them how to run their business when the experience was already in the business and had been working. They outsource thinking, so that's a good motto. Don't trust your thinking to someone else. When the knowledge is in the room, it's not only less expensive in terms of mistakes, but I'm sure McKinsey and others cost a lot of money as well. So you're literally shedding money to get things wrong. So a few other examples. We talked about Nike in COVID. There's the usual suspects. I used to work for these guys. At one point, Digital was the world's second biggest computer company. They pioneered networking. They were second only to IBM. They kind of were successful for decades. And then they got bought by Compaq, despite dismissing the PC. How ironic. They got bought by a PC company, and then Compaq didn't know what to do with DEC, and Compaq got bought by HP. So all these companies died from self-inflicted disasters. That's the issue. It wasn't necessarily the competition putting them out of business. It was their decisions that put them out of business. So let's look at critical thinking and decision support. So a little bit of history. I just mentioned how the Devil's Advocate came about in 1587 from Pope Sixtus V, which is a nice tongue twister. And then it was adopted. The reason it's called red teaming is at the time of the Prussian Napoleonic Wars, the Prussians, who played in Prussian blue, wanted to simulate what the Napoleonic army would do. So they set themselves up as the opposing team, played in red, did wargaming and tabletop simulations. That's where the term red teaming comes from, because it's the colors of the Napoleonic army. They used Kriegsspiel or war games in German. In Israel, they used the Yom Kippur War. This Ibta Mistabra means on the contrary. So the 10th man principle is if 9 people agree, the 10th person has to come up with a plausible alternative to be considered. And that was then used in World War Z by Brad Pitt as the example of how the Israelis fought the zombies, right? So it comes up in all sorts of places, but it's a real practice as used by them in the 70s. But really importantly for what's happening right now is the day after 9/11, on the 12th of September, the director of the CIA set up the Red Cell to understand why America did not see this coming. This is where red team thinking really takes the serious mainstream as core thinking. And it did so right up until the last days of the Trump government version 1, because Trump didn't like it. This is your strategic weapon, guys. And so that was set up as the red cell, and then things went from there. Now, important, the military use red team thinking, but of course they get overridden by politicians. So when things go along in the military battlefield, it's not necessarily the military that made the mistake, it's the politicians looking to get re-elected that told them what to do, because it's their decision ultimately. So what have I done with this? Well, I started talking about strategy in 2019. In fact, I did that same talk with Agile India in 2022. As COVID was breaking and I was learning about red team thinking, we were in Whitehall doing a scenario modeling exercise on how could the pandemic unfold. None of us are virologists in the room here, are all from different backgrounds. I used to be a programmer. In that, we did pre-mortem, which is like post-mortem, but nobody had to die first. So you're imagining a failure scenario. You're then working backwards in that failure scenario. I imagined the economic collapse, which didn't quite happen. But the preceding steps, one of the preceding steps was there's a second strain of the virus, and it's worse than the first, and there's a second lockdown. I had no experience of virology whatsoever, yet I came up with a scenario that actually happened. Therefore, that foresight would have been useful had somebody paid attention to it. And that's the value of this, that even not being an expert, I still came up with an answer. That's how powerful these tools are. We also used them in Agile 2025 that Scott mentioned, in which we looked at funding models for this global conference of 800 events across the world. And we decided as the red team not to take sponsorship, because that would give the sponsor too much weight. Therefore, it became a free festival, and no sponsor was able to command the voice of 800 events across the festival. So that was us turning down lots of money, which could have been the easy choice. We took the difficult choice and it proved successful. We had over 30,000 people attending events connected with the festival. I've also given talks at Napier University, guest lectures on that. And last summer we did an exercise for the NHS and the Scottish Government on COVID recovery. So let's now connect this to leadership. One growth area certainly in Agile is product ops. Melissa Perry talks about it. I'll come to her book in a second. And just to show some key quotes about that and how it aligns to critical thinking. Now, there's a lot of content here, but what I did is I went onto Kindle, I looked at the top areas that people were highlighting and what they found interesting. And this one is about the quality of decision making. That's one of the top thinkings. Product ops is about the quality of decision making. The next one is about strategic decision making. And the next one is about supporting the people that make the decisions. So product ops is not about making decisions, it's about facilitating the information to give to the people who make decisions so that better decisions are then made. So you can see how critical thinking really aligns strongly to product ops. Compatible, it's about decision making, it's about the right decisions and the right information, and it's about supporting the process rather than doing anybody out of a job. It's about the leaders who make the decisions still being the ones that make the decisions, but it's about giving them better information to help them decide. And again, it's about productive conversations so leaders are more effective. We do live in a world where there's now lots of data and lots of analytics, but we saw with the Nike and also New Coke, that disaster, they did lots of research, it turned out to be a failure. Data itself is not enough. And this is really important in the AI age, where we can get lots of data, but we need a balance. The data tells us how it is now. The insight tells us how we should evaluate that and what that data really means. Are people buying products because it's on sale, or because it's summer and it's hot and they're buying more of the product? What does that really mean? You know, or has our competitor just gone bust, so everybody's just buying our stuff? And then the analysis, what does that mean in terms of how we progress in the future? Is this repeatable? What's the market going to look like? So these three-way view is really important. The good old Agile manifesto. Let's do another version of that. Well, okay, let's just have a look and see what's going on here, because a lot of people are saying, oh, let's not talk about Jira, and that's a tool and whatever else. Yeah, of course, the stuff on the left matters more, but where would we be without online tools now? You know, take away Zoom, take away Teams, take away product ops, take away DevOps, take away your Kanban boards, we'd be stuck with Post-its, we'd all be in one room. I mean, what's that going to be like? Right? We need processes and tools. They, to me, are the foundations, and the individual interactions then take it further. And they present the soft skills that layer on top of the hard skills. Both are needed. And so we need all this working collaboratively rather than saying this is more important than that. It's about a balanced view. So now on to the third tool. And this came up actually in the previous talk that I was in about executives saying one thing and doing something else, right? So again, this is a great tool to start in an engagement. And this brings out the elephant in the room. In talking about the vulnerable thing we really should be talking about, it helps to embed psychological safety. It creates trust and alignment because we're then talking about the right thing. We may well get multiple problems. Then we can dig deeper when we've got that out there. And it's important to focus on the audience at hand. So if it's senior leadership, it's about strategy. If it's middle management, it might be the problems that they're facing. So what are people not willing to talk about? And there's a good example of this in a bank. They might say, we put our customers first. Obvious statement, we would want to disagree with that. But in a lies who tell ourselves session with an executive, we primed the executive to say, are we okay with this? There was silence. None of the directors wanted to speak up and say, we're lying. And then the chief executive said, of course that's a lie. Of course we don't put our customers first. If the regulator wants something, the customer wants something and incompatible, who do you think is going to win? The regulator. The regulator always comes first in a bank, right? And then, if the regulator says it's okay, we've then got the shareholders to consider. So if the customers want something but it's going to tank the stock price, who do you think is going to win that battle? Right, of course it's going to be the shareholders. So the customers generally come third, but that's not a really good marketing message. But it's about really being honest with our conversation to say, where does the customer sit? And how does that then fit in to the general picture? So here's some example lies. People are number one asset, except they're hired and fired at will. That's not very respectful. First thing that goes is rather than, you wouldn't fire your relative, but you fire your staff, right? So you have to really, number one, why are you getting rid of them? Can you not solve it a different way? Where in work where you're most effective? Well, that's about remote working. Well, you might say that, but actually then expect people in the office 3 days a week, whatever that means. Only the best get promoted when it's off from personal networks. Our recruitment process is data-driven. When we saw it wasn't data-driven in Scott's talk, because it wasn't driven by the data of how much experience do you have, it was driven by the data of how many certificates do you have. So there's lots of this sort of stuff. Oh, by the way, my favorite, you're on the phone, there's 20 minutes for them to answer. Your call is important to us. Well, if it was, you would have answered the phone already, right? Of course it's not. Oh, this project's on schedule, and time, and budget. Right, okay. And then it's not. Okay, right, fine. So these things happen. And some are obviously more serious than others. So in uncovering the truth, I've used assumptions here because these probably were assumptions, but you can tell, you could turn around an assumption into what could have been a lie. So Kodak might have told everybody, we will continue to succeed with film, knowing that actually, because they'd invented digital cameras, that was coming down the road. So that might have been an internal messaging around their line of business. So people then didn't feel a lack of confidence and leave. Blockbuster assumed people would want to pay late fees. So maybe that was a lie of late fees will be the thing, and we're optimizing that and get as many late fees as possible. And of course, they went out of business. And Nike assumed the consultants had the answers. Well, I bet you somebody said on the board, the consultants will provide the answers for us. They didn't. And nobody called that out then or acted on it. And again, the government assumed and maybe told the public this could be like the flu. So we're prepared accordingly, not knowing that it wouldn't be. And of course, I got Jet Airlines, they were an Indian company. They had actually really high costs, but then went bust because budget airlines came in and they didn't react quickly enough. So they just assumed, a bit like Digital I used to work for, that although they had high costs, their even higher revenue was protecting them. So you may well have heard lies at work. Let's not call them alternative facts, because there is only one fact, the real one. And have you heard things at work? And are people actually challenging that? So what lies do we as an Agile community hear about Agile? I will move on to the next one. So if you want to again go back to the online, you've got a minute. So again, it's just quick answers, just to get the feeling in the room. What do you hear about Agile in your organization that's potentially not, entirely the truth, that maybe this transformation will be our number one priority? Or we've got one answer already, so. "20 seconds left. So if you put whatever you've got, it doesn't really matter. It's just to get a sense of what's going on. Do the countdown clock there. 18 people, lots of people typing. 6 seconds to go. There we go. Wow, there's a good one. Agile is dead. Well, I just told you it wasn't, right? I had real data, right? Excellent. Let's stop talking about Agile dead, because then it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's a process. And all this stuff, right? Loads of stuff, right? We follow true Agile. I don't know what that is exactly, but again, one of the other things I see is a framework will be the answer. So we'll get safe in. And in some circumstances, it can be the next most logical move, but in many others, it might not be because it's too prescriptive. In an organization I worked in, they did 3-month rolling planning rather than 3 months at a time. And that meant we were doing incremental planning, which is surely more agile. But SAFE would never do that because it conflicts with their core way of working. That core way of working evolved in 2011 before there was video conferencing. So of course it made sense to bring people together to get that cultural embedding. That made sense then, but 3 months rolling planning makes more sense now, but SAFE will never sell you that one. So interesting to get what people's perspectives are. So with this practice of lies we tell ourselves, the steps you then follow as the logical process takes us to a positive conclusion is, why is it a lie? So why are people saying that? It may be a good message, but why are we not living the message? Right? Something's getting in the way. So explain why it's a lie, right? And then, again, like, if you have metrics, the metrics drive the behavior, right? So if your metric is velocity and story points, people then optimize for more story points and put in a 13-pointer or an 8. So the metric set becomes the target. But like this lie, if it becomes the organizational totem pole, as it were, it then drives the behaviors. So if we think that certifications are important, it could drive the behaviors of more people going to courses. Then, to make this positive, say, but how do you turn the lie around so it's true? So what would need to change for that to be a true statement? And then what would the benefits of that be? So as an example, lies we tell ourselves. Organizations would benefit from frameworks because that's the thing that's sold to them. That must be happening, right? It's not true because agility exists independently of frameworks. I was a program manager. We delivered a program end to end in 6 months. We worked in an agile way. We did not reference ever a single agile framework. We had the right people in the room to make the right decisions speedily with the empowerment to do so, and they were leaders. So we're doing it entirely at the leadership level. We could turn things around quickly. And if you think back, in a situation where you've got a crisis, like your website's down, or there's some business problem, or there's a new story about to break, a lot of organizations used to set up a war room, bring the right people together, decide what to do quickly and effectively, make a decision with the experience in the room, and execute. That's agility. That's what agility really is. It's about responding quickly with the experience in the room. You don't need Scrum for that. So agility exists independently of frameworks. But the impact of the lie is we need to sell frameworks. So it becomes its own industry. But how could you make it true? And I was thinking, well, maybe you could just adapt the framework to give it much more flexibility and say, here's a toolkit, liberating structures, red team thinking. It's about understanding the right tool for the job in the context. Let's call that a framework instead. And that would better fit the organizational culture. That came up in one of the other talks as having better fit to the problem. Therefore, the benefit is more successful transformations. And that's how I've taken a lie into a positive outcome. And that's what you need to do to make it happen. And you can take that with any lie and use those steps to turn it around into something positive. So, implementing red teaming in an organization. There are a few rules to observe and apply. One is, don't be a jerk, right? Don't go around criticizing everybody, saying that's not going to work. I know that. Nothing like that. It's about constructive consent and not trying to be the biggest brain in the room that people then just don't want to work with. It's about being the helpful person who is asked to help and support, because the top cover is essential. That means that a leader above you says, it's okay for me to do this. Because if I stir up uncomfortable truths, I know my leader supports what I'm doing. So that's what I mean by top cover. It only works if you let it. There's no point doing an exercise to come up with the answers. If then you choose to ignore it, that's just tick box, and that doesn't work. It needs to change behaviors. Don't keep doing this all the time. If you do this in real life, it can be really exhausting. It's mentally exhausting. When we do our induction course, we deliberately don't make it a full day. We've split it into 2 half days, even though that's more costly because it's overnight, because we know that after 3 or 4 hours, people get tired. And then they don't focus, so they don't get so much out of it. So doing things all the time is exhausting and can slow things down if you're always questioning every decision. And also red team. So if you've got people doing this and questioning decisions, look at how they work. Is it the same people the whole time? Do we need to rotate them around? What practices are they using? So you're always self-evaluating how you're actually going about the process. So it's like coaches coaching coaches. It's bringing about continuous improvement rather than just letting people get on with it. So we're always going to question how we work ourselves. And of course, there's no silver bullets. Don't have to keep saying that. We're trying to predict the future more reliably, and we may still get it wrong, right? But if you're wrong the whole time, that would be a bad look. So it's improving the quality of decision-making to make it less likely that you're wrong. And then don't give up, because this is like learning Agile properly. It takes work. It's more than just a course. It's study, and it's practicing it. And there's books on the. I'll point them to later. There's one of them down there. But it's a practice. And like a practice, you don't just pick it up overnight. And this is the difference. It's not consulting, right? You're not selling a thing. You're drawing out the experiences already in the room. It's not, here's a report and there's your answers. It's about, here's some practices and techniques for the context and problem at hand. Do you have a plan? Do you have a strategy? Do you have alignment? So you're adapting that to the situation. What it's not is not to develop a better plan. It's to take the plan and then improve it. So if you take that first analogy of chucking the plan away to say, we've done a better plan, there you go, you'll just create enemies, right? If you say, this plan is good, but there are a few things I'd like to draw to your attention, what do you think? More productive conversation, and we're improving what's there, then nobody feels their job's at threat because they can still work on that with that new information. It's not to make the decision, as I said with Product Ops, is to facilitate a better decision being made. And it's not to be negative and point at mistakes. It's to support the people who did the plan and help them to succeed through better analysis and decision making. Such that, and it was mentioned in the previous talks about considering, well, our strategy is not A, B, C, and D, right? It's, well, it might be A and B, and then there might be this alternative that we might need to do now. It might be an alternative we need in our back pocket just in case. It's about considering optionality because we can predict the future reliably, but we need to be ready for when things change rather than, oops, it's a surprise, we didn't have any protective equipment, so we better order it in. It's too late, Considering what could happen and being ready. So as I say, the buy-in from senior leadership, having some problem or plan to work with, support from the people that did that, and also just not want to solve the world peace, just focus on the problem in hand and be focused. A quick overview of the tools. So the UK Ministry of Defence uses the practice. As you can see, it's not a process. You might do this, you might do this, you might do this, or you might go back to do this, or you might do that, or you might do that. It's about adapting to the context in hand. And that's how they classify the tools: analytic tools, imaginative tools, and contrarian tools. Under analytic, I can mention a few of these here. 6 strategic questions already done. Assumptions challenge is quite an in-depth thing, which we wouldn't have time to do here, but that's looking at a plan. What assumptions were stated and unstated? Like, is it explicitly in the plan, or would something need to happen to make that true? And then what we do, typically you'll find about 50 assumptions in the plan, because I've done this many times, and then there's a filtering process to bring out the ones to talk about. An alternative futures analysis is consider like, well, imagine like a risk analysis. If this happens and that happens, what's the effect of that? Or if that happens and this happens. So you're kind of modeling how risks interplay, because as we see from disasters on TV, there's usually a sequence of events, not just one thing in isolation. So this looks at modeling how the plan could unfold in different directions, depending on scenarios. The imaginative pre-mortem I've talked about is like saying, imagine a future in which there's failure, then work backwards. That was devised by Dr. Gary Klein, who designed the White House Situation Room after 9/11, because it was found to be an ineffective place for decision-making. That's his one, and it changes the mindset because people don't want to talk about failure. But when you make failure the scenario, then work backwards, you actually find you're maybe closer to that than you would think because you're already stepping down that road. This is about modeling stakeholder behavior. And this is about taking a potential future event. We've heard about like black swans. Well, Swan Dive is about imagining a future scenario and saying, well, if that scenario was to unfold, what would then be the effects of that? Right? So now we've considered that, then we're backwards to say, what would be the preceding factors that would lead to that scenario? So you build up a network map of all the potential preceding events, all the potential events that could occur. Some might be great, some might not be great. And then you're looking at commonalities to then plow through that to see how it could all unfold. Contrarian, you've heard about Devil's Advocate, we've talked about this, but this is an enhanced version in which you're taking a plan and then enhancing it by passing it to a different team to say how would you improve that plan, and then passing to another team to say where are the weaknesses, and then taking that and passing it back to the first team, and then say, well, what do you think? And often that comes back as a much better plan because you've had two additional perspectives on it. Us versus them, that could be like almost like setting up a debate to argue different positions. And the enemy within is a really powerful thing. To do the enemy within, imagine you're in an organization and you're a spy and your task is to take out the organization, right? That's the imagined scenario. But you can't use weapons and you can't break the law. How would you go about it? Really powerful stuff. Come up with that and then present it back to your security team and say, you thought about this one? It can also lead to strategies, right? So what is the organization doing that's poor decision making that's actually trying to defeat its own ends? Where does that add value? Like clarity. Right? So 6 strategic questions add clarity. We've got alignment on the problem. Capability. We're employing these skills regularly. The more we do, the better we get at it. And culture, the culture of being able to question and talk about different options. David Marquet talked about these 3 values in the Turn the Ship Around video. There's a really good video to see that. He talks about the 3 C's. And again, now going back to the problem, like what was the problem statement in Agile? There's the clarity adds value. What can Agile do? Clarity. Clear priorities, clarity. Capability is about helping leaders to be better. And culture is right down there, right? So it's directly aligning what David Marquet is saying to the problems that we're seeing in Agile surveys. I mentioned briefly, I think, mind the gap. So just coming into that as another technique. That was in the argument dissection of there's a gap in the thinking, but actually mind the gap is a practice in its own right. So when you look at a plan, you can consider all the strategic choices that I've made. Is it buy versus build? Is it cloud versus on-premises? Is it Microsoft versus Google? Whatever the key choices were. And then look at those choices in the plan. And then look at the objectives you want the plan to have achieved. What are the stated objectives in the plan? But then look at the content of the plan. Read the content and go, actually, if we follow this content as described, we're not going to meet the objectives. Right? So across all of those dimensions, you then see, will the plan meet the objectives? Right? Because then you can have a proper discussion about, well, we're not going to make that because we're not doing the work necessary to move the dial. And this is what it can end up looking like. So these are all the dimensions across the top. The where we are is the blue, the where we want to be is the green. They're flagging up where there are potential areas for actually the plan's not robust in that area. So therefore we need to consider and talk about that. So now onto a list of the tools. I'm going to scoot through this fairly quickly, but it's a recap at the same time. Cynefin is actually part of this framework too. Like Cynefin exists outside Agile, but understanding how to approach a problem. Do we have the answers up front? Okay, complicated. Do we need to experiment? right? So it's more complex, right? So the right approach. Think right share we've covered. Already in product, I'm speaking to product leaders that use pre-mortem, it's a really powerful technique about what could happen, what could go wrong here. Let's have a considered discussion. In the problem statement section, I brought these three in. And then in the section on biases and decision making, I brought in these two. We talked about lies we tell ourselves. This was brought in the analytic tooling section just very briefly as additionals. Another two from the imaginative tooling section. Another three from the contrarian tooling section. Mind the gap, that was a slide by itself. And then the rest. So like liberating structures, there's a toolbox. Obviously, I don't have time to cover all these, but I've given you three: think, write, share, 6 strategic questions, and lies we tell ourselves, because these are the tools to start using. So now what? This is from the world's largest bank. Our red team exercise was one of the most pivotal moments for our business. This is a growth area. Agile is not dead. Agile is growing here, and product ops, and leadership, and better ways of thinking. World's largest bank. An alternative, breast cancer charity. We use it all the time. Game changer. The CEO. Right? This is what leaders need. Oh, and as of last week, as used in India. It has once again been my honor to share red team thinking with hundreds of senior officers at the Indian War College, and to see that the Army Chief of Staff has added my book to his official reading list. India is making red teaming its own and taking it to new levels. Jai Hind. I hope that's something good, right? That was last week, and there's the link. And he's now going on to use in Bollywood some film project about the message. So that Bryce lives in California, but he's a global speaker and he's a Forbes author. He's in demand because this is what leaders need. But it's not just, as I say, for the military. This is probably one of the top CEOs of the last 100 years. He thinks red teaming is great, right? Alan Mulally was the head of Boeing Airlines after 9/11, when there was a crisis of confidence in the airline industry. He turned them around. He then got headhunted by Ford and turned them around too, such that by the time of the financial crisis in 2008, Ford was the only company that did not need a financial bailout. That is the subject of the book, American Icon, which was a New York Times bestseller. He then went on and was headhunted to be a director of Alphabet. He's a multi-billionaire. He is very successful, and he and Marshall Goldsmith talk about red teaming and constructive challenge as absolutely essential for success. And it was because Alan Mulally embodied these principles that Bryce Hoffman, who wrote the book about Alan Mullally's leadership called the American Icon, Ford wanted to keep those skills in-house when he moved on to Alphabet. And sadly, they didn't, because they chose their preferred leader rather than the one that had the skills to carry this on. But that was where this thinking came from. That was how Bryce Hoffman picked it up and wrote the book on it. CEO of the year, multi-billionaire. All these failures. Who's next, right? But it doesn't have to be an absolute failure, right? It doesn't have to lead to catastrophe and the business going bust. Let's just take bad decisions all over the organization and try not to make quite so many. So what can you do? Think about these. What is your company talking about in its long-term future? What assumptions are they making? Are they just assuming AI is going to rule the world, right? Will that prove true? Yeah. which of these pose the biggest risk to your success? And if that assumption is false, how early would you know? So how soon can you actually say that it's false and then make that information visible so you don't continue in the wrong path for too long? So again, let's get your thoughts on what you will do next. Do think, right, share. You don't have to just type in as soon as this comes up, but it's really good for you to consider your thoughts and what you'll do next and then put them on the thing. So I should have opened that out for your thoughts as to what you're going to do next, because it's interesting to know how this talk's landing, what you've thought, how it could be relevant in your role. I'll give you, I think, a minute to do that. Eleven people on, 3 people typed already, so take your time. There's about 50 seconds left. Again, it's just like quick answers. Doesn't have to be too considered. You can always build on it later. Nine people so far. Oh, is it closed it early? Sorry. I'll open it again. So we've got 15 submissions so far, about 10 seconds to go. We'll just submit and get the feeling in the room. And that's it. So I've stopped that, it's closed it now. Show the results, what you're going to do next. Drink beer. Excellent. So try it out, review, reflect. Again, it's great to get that spread. I mean, it might not be for everybody in every situation, but that spread of feeling of don't outsource thinking, thank you for remembering that. Work and rise to tell us that there's lots of practical stuff you can do. I've given you a big tool set and I've given you experience of 3. So thank you very much for that. And there's a tool set so far. Who wants to take a picture? I've not even spoken about the last ones, like outside-in analysis is about macro forces and how they could play out and affect your business. There's some books. Again, you get the slide deck, so but there's lots of people writing about this. The logic of failure and how we get things wrong, that's the Red Teaming book. This is David Marquez, you probably heard him ship around. How he turned around a submarine, which is a critical environment that people have died on, in 8 months, with legacy technology and everything was bespoke, with that, just like a bank, but he did in 8 months, and bank takes 5 years. It's about leadership. That's what made the difference. This is about a chap that's actually in the group that I'm working in on Red Team Thinking, who actually planned the Iraq War. So these are the company and people that I learn off of. Now, of course, that didn't necessarily turn out well, but that's the example of military advising, and there's the evidence, but politicians then overriding the decision. He was director of the Red Team School that got wound up by Trump. And then, of course, product ops by Melissa Perry. So, thank you. There's my contact details. And recently won our top 50 Thought Leadership and Product Management Award. There's the contact information and another Nobel laureate coming in at the last minute there. He probably wasn't this century, so he might have been a bit older than that. Again, this isn't new. But what I can do now is questions and feedback. So if you want to ask a question, or you want to just provide feedback on the talk, I'm open to, I think I've got about 5 minutes left. Yeah, so any questions? Feel free to put your questions up, because that's what we've covered, and those are the 3 tools that you've used today.
Hello. Hi. We saw a lot of tools today.
Yeah.
That helps with decision probably in the right way.
Yeah.
How does it compare with making decisions at pace? Because that's an area most people struggle with, or most organizations struggle with. Spending a lot of time on the decision space itself.
So making decisions at pace. Well, certainly the thing is, when I've done this in real life, and I've done this actually as a training session, we've taken a modeled plan, we've run through it, and within the space of a couple of hours or more, we've come out and called out the experience in the room, has called out like 50 assumptions. We then use a filter to go, well, what ones are most likely to prove true, what ones have the most impact to prove true, and what ones can we do something about. So within a couple of hours, we've actually got a set of stuff we can then discuss. Right? It does, I mean, considering the previous approach might be to go off and study the plan and then work it through and analyze in great detail, that might take days or weeks. This is accelerating that into maybe hours. I mean, you could obviously take longer if you wanted to, but then the next process is, well, with these things then being called out, take it back to the planners and say, what do we do about that? And that's back to them.
Thank you.
Hi. So I am an architect at my organization. My question is, can these tools be applied by themselves in specific situations? So for example, Think Right Share is something that I could extensively use with engineering teams. Lies We Tell Ourselves is something I could use with the leadership. But are these can they be applied individually, and are they effective? I do see some of these tools being super helpful in my job as I drive consensus, conversations, all that. So I think setting up a red team is like a big ask, and the whole process. So I just want to understand, can these be applied in bits and pieces?
Oh, yeah. So the 2 parts to the thing. The concept of the red team as a different group, that's how the military used. So I'm not talking about red team thinking, which is a practice. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a different group. It's a thing that you just do in your teams because it's a useful thing to do. The issue with having it as a separate team is they can almost become a target. They need their own funding. It didn't work so well in organizations, right? So having it as a practice means you stop using a red team and you start employing the critical thinking practices in existing teams. And as a tool set, as I said, typically things like Lies We Tell Ourselves and 6 Strategic Questions are great openers to get alignment on the thing. But then where you go from that depends on what you find, right? And as I tried to show from the military, it's like, well, you can go backwards and forwards, you can try stuff. It depends what turns up. And it's flexible. It's like Agile coaching. Well, should we do story mapping, or should we do, this or that? It's like you look at the context and you go, well, maybe we're having an issue with stakeholders, right? So let's do some stakeholder mapping, some influencer engineering. Let's look at who the stakeholders are, how disruptive they can be, who's fully on our side and who's not, and then focus on the ones that are slightly against us, because the ones that are really against us are not going to change their minds. But if you've identified the ones that are slightly against you, that's where you spend your time. You convert them to maybe being neutral, which then makes the ones that are more opposed more isolated, and then they might move. So it depends on the problem you've got in front of you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? How are we doing for time?
Hi. So we spoke about 3 sections: the strategic one, imaginative, and collaborative, right? And you showed a correlation between the 3, right?
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, like, if there is a correlation between the first and the third, you are doing basically you said you can be a devil's advocate, right? So when you go from first to the third, you kind of sort of end up in a loop. And what is the crossing that, or what is the point that you can consider to exit out of that loop?
Well, I mean, they say this is how the MOD classify it, and they've just divided the tools into those three things. But as I say, you can stop at any point when you feel you've got valuable information, right? That is just simply showing that it's not do step one, do step two, do step three, and there's your answer. It's about saying, here's a set of tools, here's how they're classified, and demonstrating it as not a process. It is about flexibility and using the right tool in the circumstances. They've just classified the tools along those three lines to help understanding what types of tools are available. So to say, well, maybe we need to look at this a different way. Let's look at the contrarian tools and see what we've got, and then decide which one is most appropriate here. And then when you present this back to the person with the problem, you're then saying, well, is that enough, or do we need to kind of reconsider that in a different way? Is that giving you what you need?
Any more questions, anyone?
No, okay.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Craig.
you.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
I forgot to open the feedback section, so if you want to provide feedback, I'll leave that open and you can do it in your own time.